The morning sun cast long shadows across the Serbian countryside as Captain Maria Volkov adjusted her radio headset for the third time in 10 minutes. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the bitter cold that had settled over the mountainous region. She commanded a small unit of peacekeepers stationed near the village of Srebrenica, where tensions between different ethnic groups had been rising for months. Maria was not your typical military officer. Born in Bulgaria to a Serbian mother and Russian father, she spoke multiple languages fluently and had earned her position through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. At 32, she was one of the youngest commanders in the international peacekeeping force, and her soldiers respected her deeply. Her ability to connect with local civilians had made her unit particularly effective in maintaining peace in the volatile region. The radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. "Commander Volkov, we have reports of unusual military movement 15 kilometers northeast of your position," came the voice of Lieutenant Thompson from the communications center. "Ah, multiple convoys heading toward the protected zone." Maria's stomach tightened. For weeks, intelligence reports had suggested that General Ratko Mladic's forces were planning something significant. The protected zone around Srebrenica was supposed to be safe, designated by the United Nations as a sanctuary for civilians fleeing the ongoing conflict. But Maria had learned not to trust such designations completely. "Copy that, Thompson." "Any word on civilian evacuations?" she asked, scanning the horizon through her binoculars. "Negative, Commander. Population appears to be staying put. They believe the UN protection will hold." Maria lowered her binoculars and looked at her small team. Sergeant Rodriguez was cleaning his rifle methodically, his face showing the strain of months in this tense environment. Corporal Hansen was reviewing maps, marking potential escape routes they had identified weeks earlier. Private Chen was monitoring local radio frequencies, trying to gather intelligence from civilian communications. What Maria's team didn't know was that their every movement had been watched for the past 72 hours. 3 kilometers away, hidden in an abandoned farmhouse, a group of Serbian soldiers had been tracking the peacekeeping unit through high-powered scopes. Their orders were specific: capture the female commander alive. Eliminate any resistance. The trap had been carefully planned. General Mladic himself had identified Maria as a significant threat to their upcoming operation. Her ability to communicate with local civilians and coordinate with international forces made her dangerous. More importantly, her capture would send a clear message to the international community about who truly controlled this territory. As afternoon approached, Maria received what appeared to be a routine distress call. A local woman claimed that Serbian forces were threatening her family in a farmhouse just outside the protected zone. The caller spoke in broken English, pleading for help, saying they had children who would be killed if help didn't arrive soon. Maria studied the location on her map. It was technically outside their patrol zone, but close enough to justify a rescue mission. Her training told her to request backup and wait for reinforcement, but the desperation in the woman's voice haunted her. She had heard similar pleas before, and delay had sometimes meant the difference between life and death for innocent civilians. "Rodriguez, Hansen, you're with me. Chen, maintain radio contact and monitor all frequencies. If we're not back in 2 hours, contact headquarters immediately," Maria ordered, checking her equipment one final time. The 3 soldiers moved carefully through the dense forest, following a path that local civilians had shown them weeks earlier. The trees provided good cover, but Maria felt increasingly uneasy as they progressed. The usual sounds of forest life seemed muted, and she noticed that birds had stopped singing entirely in this area. Rodriguez noticed it too. "Commander, this feels wrong. Too quiet." Maria raised her hand, signaling them to stop. Through her binoculars, she could see the farmhouse clearly. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and clothes hung on a line outside, suggesting normal family life. But something felt off about the scene. The positioning of items outside seemed too deliberate, too perfect. "I'm going to circle around and approach from the back," she decided. "You two maintain position here and cover me. If anything goes wrong, retreat immediately and report back to base." What Maria couldn't see were the 12 Serbian soldiers positioned strategically around the farmhouse, each with clear fields of fire. The woman who had called for help was real, but she was calling under duress, forced to lure the peacekeeping commander into a carefully prepared ambush. As Maria moved through the underbrush toward the back of the farmhouse, her radio crackled with a transmission that chilled her blood. Private Chen's voice came through, urgent and frightened. "Commander, we're picking up Serbian military radio traffic. They're talking about the package and securing the target. I think this might be a trap." But the warning came 30 seconds too late. As Maria tried to key her radio to respond, she felt the cold metal of a rifle barrel pressed against her neck. A voice speaking accented English said quietly, "Drop your weapon, Commander Volkov. Move slowly, and your men might live through this." Maria's mind raced through her options. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but her training had prepared her for capture scenarios. The most important thing was keeping her soldiers alive and protecting the information she carried about peacekeeping operations and civilian safe houses. She could hear Rodriguez calling her name through the radio, but the Serbian soldier behind her increased pressure on her neck with his rifle. "Tell them you are investigating the house and will report back shortly," he commanded. Nothing more. Maria keyed her radio. "Rodriguez, continuing investigation. Will report in 30 minutes. Maintain position." She hoped her team would recognize the subtle code they had established for dangerous situations. The unusual formality of her language and the extended timeline. The Serbian soldiers moved with professional efficiency. Within minutes, Maria found herself zip-tied and blindfolded, loaded into the back of a military vehicle. As the truck bounced along rough roads, she tried to memorize every turn, every sound, anything that might help her understand where they were taking her. She thought about the village of Srebrenica, about the thousands of civilians who believed they were safe under international protection. If the intelligence reports were correct, those people were about to face something terrible. And now the one person who might have been able to warn them or coordinate their protection was helpless, bound in the back of an enemy vehicle. The truck finally stopped, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. Maria was dragged from the vehicle and marched into what sounded like a large building. The blindfold was removed, and she found herself in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, converted into a makeshift command center. Maps covered the walls, showing the entire Srebrenica area with military positions marked in detail. Radio equipment filled several tables, and she could hear communications in Serbian discussing troop movements and timing for something called Operation Storm. Her heart sank as she realized she was looking at the command center for what would become one of the worst massacres in European history since World War II. A tall man in a general's uniform approached her. His face was weathered, and his eyes held a coldness that made Maria's skin crawl. "Commander Volkov," he said in perfect English. "I am General Mladic. You have been quite troublesome for my operations. But now you will have a front-row seat to watch how real soldiers handle ethnic cleansing." Maria stared back at him defiantly. "The international community will not stand for this. You cannot massacre innocent civilians and expect no consequences." Mladic laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "The international community? You mean your small peacekeeping force? By tomorrow morning, Srebrenica will be cleansed, and your precious international community will issue strongly worded statements and do absolutely nothing." As Maria was led to a holding cell in the basement of the warehouse, she could hear radio communications confirming her worst fears. Thousands of Serbian soldiers were moving into position around Srebrenica. The massacre would begin at dawn, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Or was there? As the heavy door of her cell slammed shut, Maria began to assess her situation with the methodical thinking that had made her an effective commander. The cell was small, but not impossibly secure. The guards seemed confident, perhaps overconfident, and most importantly, she had heard enough of their radio communications to understand their operational timeline. If she could escape, she might still have time to warn the civilians, or at least coordinate some kind of resistance. But escape would require careful planning, precise timing, and a considerable amount of luck. As she settled into the cold, damp cell, Maria began to formulate a plan that would either save thousands of lives or get her killed in the attempt. The basement cell smelled of dampness and despair. Maria had been studying every detail of her prison for 6 hours, memorizing the guard rotation schedule, the sound of footsteps on the floor above, and the layout of the building from what she could hear through the thin walls. The Serbian soldiers were disciplined, but followed predictable patterns, changing shifts every 4 hours with a 15-minute gap when the outgoing guard briefed his replacement. During the first shift change, Maria had counted exactly 93 seconds when no guard was stationed directly outside her cell. It wasn't much time, but it might be enough if everything went perfectly. The problem was the cell door itself. A heavy steel barrier with a sophisticated lock that would require tools she didn't possess. What the Serbian soldiers hadn't realized when they searched her was that Maria carried a small titanium lockpick disguised as a hairpin, a skill she had learned during specialized training for missions behind enemy lines. The pin was thin enough to avoid detection, but strong enough to manipulate most standard military locks. As the second shift change approached, Maria positioned herself near the door and began working on the lock mechanism. Her fingers moved carefully, feeling for the tumblers inside the cylinder. The first pin clicked into place, then the second. She paused when she heard footsteps above. Someone was moving around in the command center, probably checking on communications equipment. The third pin was stubborn, requiring her to apply pressure from an unusual angle. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold temperature. If she was caught attempting escape, she would certainly be executed, and any chance of warning the civilians in Srebrenica would die with her. Finally, the lock clicked open just as she heard the outgoing guard approaching for the shift change. Maria eased the door open a fraction of an inch, enough to hear the conversation between the guards, but not enough to be visible if someone glanced in her direction. "Anything from the prisoner?" the incoming guard asked in Serbian, silent as a tomb. "General says we move her to the execution site at 0400. Before the main operation begins," the departing guard replied. Maria's blood ran cold. She had less than 3 hours before they would come for her. And the main operation, the massacre, would begin shortly after her execution. The timeline was even more compressed than she had feared. The guards completed their exchange, and the new sentry settled into position at a desk approximately 20 feet from her cell door. Maria could hear him organizing paperwork and adjusting his radio. This guard seemed more alert than the previous one, occasionally walking the corridor to check on things. Waiting for another shift change was not an option. Maria would have to escape while this guard was on duty, which meant finding a way to neutralize him quietly. She had no weapons, but her military training included hand-to-hand combat techniques designed for exactly this type of situation. The opportunity came when the guard's radio squawked with a transmission from the command center. As he stood to adjust the radio's antenna for better reception, Maria slipped out of her cell and moved silently along the wall. The concrete floor was cold against her bare feet. They had taken her boots, but it also muffled her footsteps. The guard was focused on his radio, trying to clarify a transmission about vehicle positioning for the morning operation. Maria approached from his blind side, using a pillar to remain hidden until the last possible moment. When she struck, it was with surgical precision, a sleeper hold that cut off blood flow to his brain without damaging his windpipe or creating noise. The guard went limp in her arms within seconds. Maria lowered him to the floor carefully, checking his pulse to ensure he was unconscious but alive. She had no desire to kill unnecessarily. Even enemy soldiers. She took his radio, pistol, and knife, then dragged his body into her cell and locked the door from the outside. Now came the dangerous part. Maria had to move through the warehouse and escape into the surrounding countryside without alerting the dozen Serbian soldiers stationed throughout the building. She had mapped the building's layout in her mind based on sounds, but actually navigating it would require both stealth and luck. The stairway to the main floor creaked slightly under her weight, but the sound was masked by generator noise from the command center. At the top of the stairs, Maria pressed herself against the wall and peered around the corner. 3 soldiers were visible, 2 working at radio equipment, and 1 studying maps on the far wall. The radio operators were discussing something intently, their backs to her position. The soldier studying maps was facing her direction, but focused on his work. Maria would have to cross 15 feet of open space to reach an exit door she had identified from the sounds of soldiers coming and going. She waited for the right moment. When one of the radio operators stood to adjust equipment settings, temporarily blocking the map reader's view, Maria moved. She crossed the open space in a low crouch, using shadows and equipment to mask her movement. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the soldiers would hear it. But their conversation continued uninterrupted. The exit door was unlocked, a security oversight that probably resulted from the soldiers' confidence in their remote location and the presence of guards. Maria eased the door open and slipped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold mountain air hit her like a physical blow. Without boots or proper clothing, she would have to move quickly or risk hypothermia. But the immediate concern was getting clear of the warehouse complex before her escape was discovered. She could see sentries positioned around the perimeter, but their attention seemed focused outward, watching for external threats rather than escapes from within. Maria moved from shadow to shadow, using abandoned vehicles and equipment as cover. The compound was larger than she had imagined from inside the warehouse. Several buildings, vehicle parks, and communication arrays spread across what had once been a small industrial complex. As she approached the perimeter fence, Maria heard voices from one of the other buildings. Serbian soldiers were preparing for the morning operation, checking weapons and receiving final briefings. The scope of the force became clear as she counted vehicles and estimated troop numbers. This was not a small raid but a major military operation involving hundreds of soldiers. The fence was topped with concertina wire, but Maria found a section where a vehicle had damaged the barrier, creating a gap large enough for a person to crawl through. She squeezed through carefully, the metal edges tearing her uniform but not causing serious injury. Once outside the compound, Maria faced a new challenge: navigation. She needed to reach Srebrenica, or a position where she could warn the civilians. But she had no map and was unfamiliar with this particular area. The stars provided general direction, but clouds obscured many landmarks she might have used for navigation. She began moving toward what she hoped was east, in the direction of Srebrenica. The terrain was difficult. Rocky slopes covered with loose stones that threatened to cause falls or create noise that might alert pursuit teams. Her bare feet were already cut and bruised, but adrenaline kept her moving. After an hour of hard travel, Maria heard the sound she had been dreading: dogs barking in the distance, back toward the compound. They had discovered her escape and were beginning a pursuit. She had perhaps a 30-minute head start, but trained military dogs would move much faster than she could over this terrain. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance confirmed her worst fears. They were mobilizing significant resources to recapture her. But the helicopter also told her something useful. She was moving in the right direction. The aircraft was heading towards Srebrenica, and she could use its flight path to correct her navigation. Maria pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her feet and the cold that was beginning to affect her coordination. She had to reach some kind of civilization or communication point before the pursuit teams caught up with her. But more importantly, she had to find a way to warn the thousands of innocent civilians who would die if General Mladic's operation proceeded as planned. As dawn approached, she could see lights in the distance, either Srebrenica itself or one of the outlying villages. But behind her, she could also hear the pursuit teams getting closer. The dogs had picked up her trail, and she could hear shouted commands in Serbian as soldiers coordinated their search. Maria was running out of time, strength, and options. But she was also close enough to civilization that she might be able to raise an alarm. The question was whether she could stay ahead of her pursuers long enough to make contact with someone who could help organize a defense or evacuation. The race against time had begun, and the lives of thousands hung in the balance. The lights Maria had seen belonged to the village of Potocari, just 3 kilometers from Srebrenica. As she stumbled down the hillside, her feet bleeding and her body shivering uncontrollably from the cold, she could see that the village was already awake despite the early hour. People were moving through the streets, and she could hear the sound of vehicles and raised voices. But these weren't normal morning activities. As Maria got closer, she realized that hundreds of civilians were gathered in the village center, many carrying suitcases and bundles of belongings. Word had somehow reached them about the approaching Serbian forces, and families were trying to decide whether to flee or trust in the UN protection. The sight that greeted Maria as she reached the edge of the village made her heart sink. These weren't soldiers or fighters, they were ordinary families. Old men carrying grandchildren, mothers clutching babies, teenagers helping elderly relatives walk. If General Mladic's forces reached this village, it would be a slaughter. Maria approached a group of men who appeared to be community leaders. They were arguing in hushed tones about evacuation routes and whether the Dutch peacekeepers stationed nearby could provide real protection. When they saw Maria, bloodied, disheveled, wearing a torn military uniform, they initially backed away in fear. "Please," Maria said in Serbian, her voice hoarse from the cold night. "I am Commander Volkov, UN Peacekeeping Forces. I have escaped from Serbian military captivity. General Mladic is planning to attack this area within hours. You must evacuate immediately." The men looked at each other uncertainly. One of them, a gray-haired man named Hassan who served as the village elder, stepped forward. "You are the UN commander who was captured yesterday?" "We heard on the radio." "Yes, they were going to execute me at dawn, but I escaped." "Listen to me carefully. They have hundreds of soldiers positioned around this area. The attack will begin after sunrise. You cannot defend against this force." Hassan translated quickly for the other men, and Maria could see the fear spreading across their faces. But she also saw something else. Determination. These people had already survived 2 years of war, and they weren't going to panic. "The UN soldiers at the base," one of the younger men asked. "Can they help us fight?" Maria's heart sank as she realized what she had to tell them. "The Dutch battalion has maybe 400 soldiers, and their rules of engagement severely limit what they can do. They cannot stop an assault by a force this size. Your only option is evacuation." But even as she spoke, Maria could hear the sound that meant evacuation was no longer possible. Helicopter rotors approaching from the direction she had come. The Serbian forces were moving faster than she had hoped, and they were using air support to speed their advance. "It's too late for large-scale evacuation," she realized aloud. "They're already moving to cut off the escape routes." Hassan grabbed her arm. "Then what do we do? We have 3,000 people here, including hundreds of children and elderly." Maria's military training kicked in. She couldn't save everyone, but she might be able to save some. "How many vehicles do you have that are working?" "Maybe 20 trucks and buses. But not enough for everyone." "Then we prioritize. All children under 12 and adults over 60 get evacuated immediately. Everyone else will have to try to reach the Dutch base or hide in the forest until this passes." As they organized the desperate evacuation, Maria could hear the sound of heavy vehicles approaching from multiple directions. She climbed to the roof of a nearby building and used binoculars borrowed from a local hunter to assess the situation. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Serbian armored vehicles and troop transports were converging on the area from 3 directions, effectively surrounding the village and cutting off most escape routes. The only gap in their formation was to the northeast, through difficult forest terrain that would be nearly impossible for elderly people and children to navigate. But Maria also saw something that gave her hope. A small convoy of Dutch UN vehicles was approaching from the direction of Srebrenica. The peacekeepers had apparently received word about the situation and were responding. It wouldn't be enough to stop the Serbian assault, but it might provide enough cover for some civilians to escape. She climbed down and found Hassan organizing the evacuation. "The Dutch are coming, but we need to buy more time," she told him. "I'm going to try to slow down the Serbian advance." "How?" "You're one person with just a pistol." Maria smiled grimly. "Sometimes one person in the right place can make a significant difference." She had noticed something during her observation from the rooftop. A narrow bridge that the Serbian vehicles would have to cross to reach the village from the main approach route. If that bridge could be damaged or blocked, it would force the attackers to take a longer route through difficult terrain, buying precious time for the evacuation. Maria took a backpack containing explosives that one of the village men had saved from his construction work, along with wire and a timer. The plan was simple but extremely dangerous. She would have to reach the bridge before the Serbian vehicles, set the charges, and detonate them at exactly the right moment to disable the bridge without killing herself in the process. The approach to the bridge took her directly toward the advancing Serbian forces. Maria moved through the forest parallel to the road, staying hidden but close enough to monitor the convoy's progress. She could see infantry soldiers spreading out through the trees, professional and methodical in their movements. When she reached the bridge, Maria had perhaps 10 minutes before the first vehicles would arrive. The structure was old but solid, a stone and concrete span that would require a significant explosion to damage. She placed the charges at the two weakest points she could identify, based on her engineering training. As she worked, Maria could hear radio chatter from the approaching Serbian forces. They were discussing the evacuation they had observed in the village, and she heard one officer say that orders were to show no mercy to military-age males, but to process the women and children according to protocol. The euphemism chilled her. She had heard intelligence reports about Serbian processing of civilians from other areas, and it never ended well. The timer was set for 3 minutes, which should give her just enough time to reach a safe distance if she moved immediately. But as Maria prepared to leave her position, she heard something that changed everything. The sound of children crying. Very close to the bridge, looking down, she saw a horrifying sight. A bus full of evacuating families had broken down just 50 meters from the bridge, directly in the path of the oncoming Serbian convoy. Parents were desperately trying to fix the engine while children pressed their faces against the windows, terrified by the sound of approaching vehicles. Maria faced an impossible choice. If she waited to help the families escape, the timer would explode the bridge with her still in the danger zone. If she left immediately, the Serbian forces would reach the broken-down bus and capture or kill everyone inside. The sound of the first Serbian vehicle approaching the far side of the bridge made the decision for her. Maria ran toward the bus, shouting for everyone to get out and take cover. The driver was frantically trying to restart the engine, but steam was pouring from the radiator, a mechanical failure that couldn't be quickly fixed. "Everyone out! Into the forest! Now!" Maria shouted in Serbian, pulling children from the bus while parents grabbed their belongings. The timer showed 1 minute remaining as Maria helped the last elderly passenger out of the vehicle. The Serbian convoy was now visible at the far end of the bridge, moving slowly but steadily toward them. 30 seconds. Maria grabbed a young mother who was having trouble carrying 2 small children and pushed her toward the tree line. "Run! Don't look back!" 15 seconds. She could see Serbian soldiers in the lead vehicle pointing in her direction, recognizing her as the escaped prisoner they had been hunting. Rifle shots cracked through the air as they tried to stop her. 5 seconds. Maria dove behind the largest tree she could find and covered her head with her arms. The explosion shook the ground like an earthquake. Chunks of concrete and stone rained down for nearly 30 seconds afterward. When Maria finally looked up, she saw that the bridge had partially collapsed, not completely destroyed, but damaged enough that vehicles couldn't cross it. The Serbian convoy had stopped at the far side of the gap, and she could see officers with binoculars studying the damage and discussing their options. It would take them at least 2 hours to find an alternative crossing point, maybe longer. Behind her, she could hear Dutch voices calling out in English. The UN peacekeepers had reached the village and were organizing a more systematic evacuation using their armored vehicles. The time Maria had bought by destroying the bridge was being put to good use, but her own situation was now desperate. The Serbian forces knew exactly where she was, and they were already sending soldiers across the damaged bridge on foot to pursue her. She was exhausted, injured, and running out of ammunition. Maria began moving through the dense forest, trying to reach the UN positions before the pursuing soldiers caught up with her. Behind her, she could hear the sound of systematic searching. The Serbians were taking no chances on letting her escape again. As she climbed over fallen logs and pushed through thick underbrush, Maria thought about what she had accomplished. The bridge explosion had delayed the Serbian assault long enough for hundreds of civilians to reach safety. The Dutch peacekeepers were now fully engaged and coordinating with other international forces to establish secure evacuation routes. But she also knew that she hadn't stopped the larger operation. General Mladic's forces would eventually find ways around the obstacles she had created, and the massacre she feared would likely still occur, just on a smaller scale than originally planned. When Maria finally stumbled into the Dutch perimeter 3 hours later, she was immediately surrounded by concerned soldiers and medics. Major van der Berg, the Dutch commander, personally debriefed her while medics treated her injuries. "Commander Volkov, your actions today saved hundreds of lives," he told her. "The information you provided allowed us to coordinate with NATO forces and establish protected corridors for civilian evacuation." Maria nodded wearily. "How many did we save?" "Nearly 800 civilians reached safety before the Serbian forces established their full perimeter." "But," van der Berg paused, his face grim, "we estimate that several thousand more are still in the area, either hiding in the forest or trapped in Srebrenica itself." The next several days would indeed see the massacre that Maria had tried to prevent. But her escape and warning had made a difference. The international community responded more quickly than General Mladic had anticipated, and while they couldn't stop the atrocities entirely, they were able to rescue many civilians who would otherwise have perished. Years later, when war crimes tribunals examined the events around Srebrenica, Maria's actions would be cited as an example of how individual courage could make a difference even in the face of overwhelming military force. The bridge she destroyed became a memorial site, and the family she helped escape never forgot the woman who risked her life to give them a chance to live. But for Maria, sitting in the Dutch medical tent as doctors bandaged her wounded feet, the satisfaction was bittersweet. She had saved hundreds of lives, but thousands more would die in the coming days. It was both a victory and a tragedy, a reminder that sometimes even heroic actions can only minimize rather than prevent human catastrophe.